June 23rd, 2009. Staples Center, Los Angeles. Michael Jackson is rehearsing for the This Is It tour. Cameras are rolling. They have been rolling for weeks, capturing every moment, every song, every dance move. The footage is meant for Jackson's personal archive. But 2 days later, Jackson is dead, and the footage becomes something else entirely. It becomes a documentary, a memorial, a final look at the artist in his last days. The film This Is It is released in October 2009. It runs 111 minutes. It shows Jackson rehearsing, singing, dancing, directing. It shows a man who appears focused, energetic, committed, but according to multiple crew members who were present during the rehearsals, the film does not show everything. There are moments that were filmed, moments that were edited, moments that were removed. And one section, reportedly lasting 11 minutes, shows something the producers did not want the public to see. Michael Jackson collapsing. Unable to continue. Visibly unwell. The question is not whether this footage exists. Multiple sources confirm it does. The question is why it was cut, and what it reveals about the final weeks of Michael Jackson's life. The This Is It rehearsals began in April 2009. Jackson had signed a contract with AEG Live to perform 50 shows at the O2 Arena in London. The tour was scheduled to begin in July. It was being billed as a comeback. Jackson had not toured in over a decade. He had not performed a full concert since 1997, and the anticipation was immense. Tickets sold out within hours. The demand was so high that AEG added more dates. 50 shows became the plan, a grueling schedule for any performer. But for Michael Jackson, a 50-year-old man with a documented history of health issues, it was a monumental undertaking. Rehearsals were held at various locations in Los Angeles: the Staples Center, the Forum, smaller rehearsal studios, and every session was filmed. The director, Kenny Ortega, was capturing the process. The idea initially was to create a personal archive for Jackson, a record of the creative process. But as rehearsals progressed, the footage took on a different purpose. AEG and the production team began to see it as potential content. A behind-the-scenes documentary, something that could be released alongside the tour or after. No one expected it to become a posthumous memorial. The rehearsals were intensive. Jackson was working long hours, choreographing, rehearsing vocals, coordinating with dancers, musicians, and technical crew. The production was elaborate. Massive LED screens, pyrotechnics, illusions. It was designed to be a spectacle. And Jackson, despite his age and physical condition, was expected to deliver. He was expected to perform at the level he had in the 1980s and 1990s. And according to those present, he tried. He pushed himself. He rehearsed until exhausted, and on multiple occasions he struggled. Crew members later described moments when Jackson appeared disoriented, moments when he would stop mid-rehearsal and sit down, moments when he seemed unable to remember choreography he had performed thousands of times, and moments when he would leave rehearsal early citing fatigue or illness. These moments were not included in the final documentary. The film shows Jackson at his best: energetic, focused, in control. But the reality, according to those who were there, was more complicated. One incident in particular stands out. It occurred during a rehearsal in mid-June 2009. Less than 2 weeks before Jackson's death. Jackson was rehearsing a dance sequence. The exact song is disputed. Some sources say it was "They Don't Care About Us." Others say it was "Smooth Criminal." What is not disputed is what happened. Jackson mid-routine stopped. He bent over, hands on his knees. Breathing heavily, the music continued, the dancers continued, but Jackson did not. He stood there, visibly struggling, and then, according to multiple witnesses, he collapsed. Not dramatically, not theatrically. He simply sat down or fell, depending on the account. He ended up on the floor. Crew members rushed over. Someone called for a medic. Jackson was assisted to a chair. He was given water. He was asked if he was okay. And according to those present, he said he was fine, that he just needed a break, that he was tired. But the cameras captured it, the entire sequence, from the moment he stopped dancing to the moment he was helped off the floor. And that footage, approximately 11 minutes in total, was cut from the final documentary. The decision to remove the footage was made during post-production. After Jackson's death, Sony Pictures acquired the rights to the rehearsal footage. They partnered with AEG Live and the Jackson estate to produce a feature-length documentary. The goal was to honor Jackson's legacy, to show him as the consummate performer, to give fans a final chance to see him at work. But the footage presented a problem, because not all of it showed Jackson in a positive light. Some of it showed a man who was struggling, who was unwell, who was, according to some interpretations, being pushed beyond his limits. The production team faced a choice. They could include the footage and risk tarnishing Jackson's image. Or they could exclude it and present a sanitized version of the rehearsals. They chose the latter. The 11 minutes showing Jackson's collapse, along with other moments of visible distress, were removed. The official reason given was that the footage was not representative of the overall rehearsal process, that it showed an isolated incident, that Jackson had good days and bad days, and that the documentary should focus on the good days. But the decision was controversial. Some members of the crew disagreed with the choice. They believed the footage should be included, not to embarrass Jackson, but to tell the full story, to show the reality of what was happening in those final weeks, to provide context for his death, because the official narrative, the one presented in This Is It, suggests that Jackson was healthy, that he was ready for the tour, that his death was a tragic accident caused by his personal physician's negligence. But the excluded footage complicates that narrative. It suggests that Jackson was not healthy, that he was not ready, and that the people around him knew it. The excluded footage has never been officially released. It remains in the possession of the Jackson estate and Sony Pictures, and according to legal agreements, it cannot be made public without the estate's approval. But descriptions of the footage have leaked. Crew members have spoken about it in interviews, some anonymously, some on the record, and their accounts paint a picture that is very different from the one shown in the documentary. One crew member, speaking to a tabloid in 2010, described the scene. He said Jackson was on the floor for several minutes, that he appeared disoriented, that he asked where he was, that he seemed confused about what was happening. The crew member said that medical personnel were called, that Jackson was examined, and that rehearsal was canceled for the rest of the day. He also said that this was not the only time Jackson collapsed, that there were other incidents, some captured on camera, some not, and that the production team was aware that Jackson was not well. Another crew member, speaking to a documentary filmmaker, said that Jackson was often cold during rehearsals, that he wore multiple layers of clothing even in the warm rehearsal spaces, that he would shiver, that his hands would shake. These are symptoms, medical experts later noted, consistent with malnutrition, dehydration, and the effects of certain medications. But at the time, according to the crew member, no one intervened. Rehearsals continued, the tour was still scheduled, and Jackson was expected to perform. The question is why? Why was Jackson allowed to continue rehearsing when he was clearly unwell? Why did no one stop the production? Why did AEG, the promoter, not postpone the tour? The answers are complicated, and they involve money, pressure, and a fundamental misunderstanding of Jackson's condition. AEG had invested heavily in the tour, millions of dollars. The O2 Arena was booked. Tickets were sold. Sponsorships were in place. Postponing or canceling the tour would have been a financial disaster. And so there was pressure. Pressure on Jackson to perform, pressure on the production team to deliver, and pressure on everyone involved to ignore the warning signs. Jackson's personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, was responsible for Jackson's medical care during this period. Murray was being paid $150,000 a month by AEG to ensure Jackson was healthy enough to perform. But instead of providing appropriate medical care, Murray was, according to later testimony, administering propofol to help Jackson sleep. Propofol is a surgical anesthetic. It is not a sleep aid, and using it outside a hospital setting without proper monitoring equipment is extraordinarily dangerous. Murray's actions would later be deemed criminally negligent. He was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, but the larger question remains, who else knew? Who else was responsible? AEG denied knowledge of Jackson's condition. They claimed they relied on Dr. Murray's assurances that Jackson was healthy, that they had no reason to believe Jackson was in danger. But emails obtained during a later wrongful death lawsuit tell a different story. In one email sent by AEG executive Paul Gongaware to Kenny Ortega, Gongaware writes that Jackson's health is a concern, that Jackson is missing rehearsals, that he appears disoriented. The email suggests that AEG was aware Jackson was struggling, and yet the tour was not postponed. Rehearsals continued, and Jackson continued to deteriorate. Kenny Ortega, the director, later testified that he had raised concerns about Jackson's health, that he had sent an email to AEG executives stating that Jackson was not well, that he needed professional help. Ortega's email, sent on June 14, 2009, describes Jackson as appearing lost, cold, and afraid. It is a stark description, and it came just 11 days before Jackson's death. But the response from AEG, according to Ortega's testimony, was dismissive. He was told that Dr. Murray was handling Jackson's care, that Ortega should focus on the production, not on Jackson's health. The 11 minutes of footage that was cut from This Is It would have provided visual evidence of Jackson's condition. It would have shown on camera that he was not well, that he was struggling, that he collapsed during rehearsal, and it would have raised questions. Questions about who knew, questions about who was responsible, questions about whether the tour should have been canceled. But those questions were never asked because the footage was never shown, and the narrative that emerged, the one presented in This Is It and repeated in media coverage, was that Jackson's death was an isolated tragedy, the result of one doctor's criminal negligence, not a systemic failure, not the predictable outcome of months of pressure and neglect. The Jackson estate, AEG, and Sony all benefited from the narrative presented in This Is It. The documentary grossed over $260 million worldwide. It became one of the highest-grossing documentaries of all time, and it solidified Jackson's legacy as a dedicated artist, a perfectionist, a performer who gave everything to his craft. But it also obscured the truth, that Jackson was not healthy, that he was being pushed beyond his limits, and that the people responsible for his care prioritized profit over his well-being. The excluded footage remains a point of contention. In 2013, the Jackson family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against AEG Live. The case went to trial, and during the trial, testimony revealed more details about Jackson's condition in the weeks before his death. Witnesses described a man who was emaciated, who was suffering from insomnia, who was dependent on prescription medications, and who was, according to some accounts, not mentally competent to agree to the tour schedule. The jury ultimately ruled in favor of AEG, finding that while Dr. Murray was negligent, AEG was not liable for his actions. But the trial revealed information that contradicted the image presented in This Is It. The Jackson estate has never released the excluded footage, and according to legal experts, they are unlikely to do so, because the footage would undermine the narrative they have carefully constructed. The narrative of Michael Jackson as a consummate professional, a tireless artist, a man who was ready for a triumphant comeback. The excluded footage would show a different Michael Jackson, a man who was struggling, who was vulnerable, who was, in the final weeks of his life, unable to perform at the level expected of him. But the footage exists. It is stored somewhere, on hard drives, in archives, and everyone involved knows it. The crew members who filmed it, the editors who cut it, the executives who approved its removal. They all know what is on those 11 minutes of tape, and they all made the choice to keep it hidden, not to protect Michael Jackson. He was already dead, but to protect the brand, the image, the legacy, and the profits that legacy generates. The question is whether the public has a right to see it, whether transparency matters more than image, whether the truth, even when uncomfortable, is more important than the myth. Michael Jackson was one of the greatest entertainers who ever lived, but he was also a human being. A human being who was exploited, who was pushed beyond his limits. and who died as a result. The excluded footage from This Is It would not change what happened. It would not bring him back, but it would provide context. It would show that his death was not just the fault of one doctor. It was the result of a system that prioritized performance over health, profit over people, and image over truth. The legacy of This Is It is complicated. On one hand, it is a beautiful tribute, a final performance, a chance for fans to see Michael Jackson doing what he loved. On the other hand, it is a sanitized version of events, a carefully edited narrative that excludes the most important parts. The parts that show the cost of fame, the price of perfection, and the reality that Michael Jackson, in his final weeks, was not the invincible performer the documentary portrays. He was a man in crisis, and the people around him knew it. If you made it this far, you understand something important, that what we see in documentaries is not always the full truth. That footage is selected, edited, curated, and that the decisions about what to include and what to exclude are not neutral. They are made with specific purposes. In the case of This Is It, the purpose was to honor Michael Jackson. But in doing so, the filmmakers and the estate excluded the very footage that would have told the full story. The 11 minutes that were cut are not just missing scenes, they are missing truth. And as long as they remain hidden, the full story of Michael Jackson's final days will never be told. Drop a comment, share your thoughts, and if this made you see This Is It differently, pass it along. Because stories like this remind us that the narratives we are given are often incomplete, that behind every polished documentary is raw footage, and that sometimes the most important moments are the ones that never make it to the screen.